I call Professor Morris.
Professor Terence Morris is a criminologist. He's Professor of Social Institutions at the University of London.
Professor Morris, you have given considerable study to the evidence or otherwise for the capital penalty as a deterrent of a commission of murder.
Yes, it's been a special interest of mine for about 30 years.
Would you tell the jury your conclusion on that question and very briefly the grounds on which you reached it?
First of all, of course, one has to remember that murder divides into a number of categories. The domestic killings, the killings by people who are pathological, killings of people in the course or furtherance of other criminal activities, and finally the terrorist.
Might we then, Professor, please take those categories separately? I think that would help the jury.
Yes.
I think your first category was domestic murder.
Yes. I think in the case of domestic murder, it is perfectly clear that there is no evidence whatsoever in either direction that the availability or otherwise of the death penalty has any effect whatsoever on the rate.
Is domestic murder a large or a small proportion of the total number of murders at the current time?
It makes up something of the order of about 60 to 65%.
So it is the major element in the murder figures.
Category, yes.
Thank you. I think your next category was pathological murder,
yes,
where the murderer is mentally abnormal.
That's right. In that case, I mean, there is absolutely no ground whatever for regarding the death penalty as a rational deterrent, because the one thing that characterizes most of these people is their gross abnormality and irrationality.
And what would you say, Professor, to those who argue that the pathological murderer should be executed and not just locked up because he may escape and commit more murders?
Well, that raises a number of serious questions, but I think we can generally say that the security in special hospitals is not so inadequate as to cause us any serious alarm.
I think your third category was murder in the course of commission of offences.
Yes. This, I think, is the most difficult category because it is the one which showed increase during the period when we divided capital punishment and non-capital punishment between the two categories. And curiously enough, the experience after 1957 is that whereas we would have expected, on the basis of the deterrent argument, non-capital murders to have increased, in fact, the only increase that was discernible was in the capital category.
Is that not a very striking piece of evidence of the irrelevance of the penalty to the incidence of murder?
Well, that's the conclusion which I'm bound to draw.
I think your fourth category was the terrorist murder.
Yes. This is a very interesting example in that we've got now a great deal of historical evidence. We've got the evidence of Irish terrorism during the 19th century, where a large number of executions were carried out, and they seem to have absolutely no effect whatsoever on the level of terrorism, which in fact increased towards the end of the period, at the end of the last century, rather than diminished. There's also the experience of terrorism in Tsarist Russia, but the best example that I would quote you is this. During the war, the organization of the French Maquis, in fact, carried out a program of terror and killing against the German occupation, which was really quite unparalleled anywhere in the history of Western Europe in this century. And yet, of course, the penalties for those who were caught were the most fearful tortures and death.
Now, your questions for Professor Morris, please, Eldon Griffiths.
Professor Morris, what experience have you yourself had of murder?
I don't quite know what you mean by that. I mean,
I'll put it very precisely. Have you yourself investigated any specific murder and dealt either with the murderer or the victim?
I have investigated, in the course of my academic researches, every murder that has been indicted as such in this country since 1957, and I have interviewed in prison a very large number of convicted murderers.
But you've had very little experience of the victims?
I have actually not seen any of the victims because they've generally been dead by the time the matter came to light.
Thank you. Why do you believe, Professor Morris, that you, with your statistical investigations in your university, are right, and that the police service, with its much greater direct experience and the fact that it has to risk the lives of its people to apprehend murderers, why do you think you're right and they're all wrong?
Well, I'm bound to tell you that I do have connections with the police service in that I lecture to the police colleges, And it is my impression that there are a considerable number of senior police officers who have the gravest doubts as to the efficacy of the death penalty.
The sort of chief police officer who sells his memoirs for money, I suppose.
Well, I wouldn't know. You represent the Police Federation, I don't.
You dealt with a number of categories, and I think you heard me say at the beginning that I could not support the death sentence for the vast majority of domestic murders, or indeed for any murder where there is diminished responsibility. So we can wash out those two categories. I want to ask you about the armed criminal gunman, the man who loads a gun and takes it out to commit a crime with the intention of using it to menace and to get rid of the witness and to shoot the police officer if cornered. Do you say that in his case that the capital sentence in no way would deter him from taking out that gun?
I think you've got to be clear in whether you say that the deterrence consists of making the carrying of a gun a capital offence, or whether the using of a gun for purposes of homicide. Because what is very clear, and it's very confusing to me as a professional criminologist, is that whereas the incidence of gun carrying has increased, the incidence of those guns having been used lethally has not increased by an expected proportion. I'm puzzled by this.
Well, can I get over your puzzlement? One of the problems is that many of the criminals are very poor shots.
No.
I want to deal, however, with the next matter, namely the professional hitman. Do you accept it as a fact that there is evidence to the security services that some of the terrorist killings are committed by hired professionals, by the jackals who kill for pay?
Oh, that's incontrovertible.
Yes. Well, now, would you not accept that such a man is above all a calculator of the odds, and that one of the things he calculates is the likelihood of his living to collect his prize money?
Indeed.
Right. Well, now, would you not think that the availability of the capital sentence would make such a professional, hired assassin more careful about taking on the job?
I think it would make him very careful indeed, but the difficulty with your argument is that we know that hired guns operate as frequently in countries where capital punishment exists as those in which they don't. And you still have to overcome the fact that the use of torture and brutal execution by the Nazis in France during the war did nothing whatsoever to deter the Maquis from carrying out their terrorist activities.
My last question is this. Your statistics don't say who was deterred. They only say who was not deterred, because it's only those who are not deterred that committed the offence. How do you know what happens to the large number of people who are deterred but who never enter into the statistics because the death penalty in their case was effective?
With respect, as you know, that is not a question that can be answered, but the question that needs to be answered is this. Why is it that the availability of the penalty, whether it is available or not available, seems not to have any discernible statistical effect on the level of the crime? If you look at the incidence of criminal homicide before 1957 in this country, you find that there were very considerable fluctuations in the levels of criminal homicide, which could not be explained by the availability or otherwise of the capital penalty because it was already there. In other words, it must be due to some other factor.
Professor Morris.